cars are made from iron, steel, aluminium, plastic and rubber. These days, this apparently indestructible assembly is coated in a cocktail of protective chemicals, sealed against the weather and painted. And yet, left in the open, a modern car can be scrap in less than 20 years, and most cars are beyond economical restoration after a mere 10. Shrink wrapping is a packaging technique where special plastic that shrinks when heated is used to cocoon and preserve a manufactured product. So what if a brand new car was shrink wrapped and stored in a dark, dry, cool place for a quarter of a century? This unused time capsule would probably be an instant classic merely by surviving. But which cars would be worth storing this way? Are there future classics under our very noses in the streets today that should be bought now and kept forever? We asked some people who ought to know. We asked them which cars they would choose as their shrink-wrapped classic. The 1990 Alfa Romeo SZ is not a handsome car, but it has character. Even today, it is a limited edition £50,000 rarity. But is it a future classic? Actor, engineer and Alfa Romeo fan James Castle thinks it is.
Well, the reason I chose this car was that it's basically so ugly. I mean, I think it's very pretty, but then I quite like ugly cars. I think ugly cars are pretty. And I mean, it also restores one's faith in Alfa Romeo as a major contributor to the car as a cultural icon, because they have created, by using a carbon fibre impregnated resin body, they haven't been compromised by the previous shapes that were made from steel cars. So basically, this is a plastic car. These huge gaps here, all over it, are actually as much a part of it as narrow gaps on an early Jaguar would be, for instance. If you look at the front, this is absolutely pure de Havilland tiger moth. Look at that shape. That is absolutely lovely. And these lights, I mean, they're the sort of lights you'd see in an art gallery. I mean, who would want to buy a car that actually looks like a football boot? And it does. These slab sides, that's where you put your foot in. There's your ankle going up there. If you feel the roof, it actually feels nice. It's quite strange. There's not many cars you can actually touch and have a kind of tactile experience with. You come round here to this aerofoil. I mean, this is a pure Boeing 707. It is actually an aerofoil. It's actually like a flap, in fact. Everywhere you go, I mean, I want to feel this car. There's this strange plastic. You know, I'm quite surprised I can pick this up like this, the petrol filler cap, and there's this nice little flap here to stop you damaging the paint. I'm quite surprised it's not locked. Certainly at home in Brixton, I think you'd need to put a sort of little lock there, probably. It's a dancing car as well. You can feel the road. It dances. You feel like you have, through the wheel, you have a relationship with it. It's got a wonderful kind of crackling, singing exhaust, which is just around about the time you got the most torque. So with the help of sound, I mean, drivers need this. It's a driver's car. The interior is something else. The interior is absolutely full of unnecessary carbon fibre. There's a panel in here on the dashboard. There's no reason for it to be there, I suppose, except that it just reminds you that you're in a sort of new tech car. This car would look terrific. It would look so terrific in my street at home in Brixton. It's the sort of car, and it would be perfectly safe. People would love it. People wouldn't want to scratch a car like this. They would, well, if they did, well, look at this. What is this car? Hey, this is yours. And I want to shake you by the hand, they'd say. They want to shake you by the hand. Give me a ride. Give me the keys, probably. No, get off. And there's a car around there, which is actually this. I suspect Alfas nicked the idea. There's this guy who's got, it's a Sierra, a Ford Sierra, and it's got tons of stuff on it. It's red, it's got all the bits added on, and he's called the Chemist. And it seems to me that Alphas have been studying the Chemist.
London's Design Museum has put renewed emphasis on the car as a cultural barometer. They don't keep many, but one that has been stored is this unlikely delivery van. It was designed at Nissan's new Pike factory in Japan as a limited edition pun on the French 2CV, or tin snail. It is the choice of non-driver and Financial Times correspondent Alice Rawsthorne.
Well, I think the Japanese see the West in the same way as we see the 19th century. So if you buy a Victorian piece of furniture, you buy it and then pluck it out of context and twist the imagery around and just use it for your own purposes. And I think the Japanese use Western imagery in much the same way. So they're fascinated by the signs and symbols of the West, but have no real interest in the sort of depth and detail of it. And so this van is built with this sort of notion of 1940s French design. It's built for the same sort of purpose that Citroën originally intended the de Chevaux to be used. And yet, it's essentially a very Japanese animal. It's blended lots of sort of West Coast design images with sort of French forms and functions. And so what Nissan did was take the idea, this notion of French cars from the 40s and 50s, in this case the de Chevaux van, and they recreated it for contemporary Japan. So the escargot is really their version of the de Chevaux. So it's taken some of the visual elements, some of the shape. It's taken the basic idea of a functional van. They've really turned it into this sort of throwaway toy. Lots of the visual ideas seem to me to be very Californian, very West Coast. So whilst in some ways this car's rather sort of frog-like, it's sort of Kermit-like rather than French frog, so it's like, you know, sort of Muppet Hollywood notions. And also to me, I mean, it's like Mickey Mouse. We've got these great big mouse eyes, and here are these little mouse ears, which are the wing mirrors. So that gives it the sort of American West Coast sort of beach baby look to the design. The reason I chose it as a classic is because this, to me, says a lot about Japanese notions of design and consumption today. There's such a sort of surfeit of everything in Japanese society that even a car, which we tend to see as this sort of very pious, practical, reverential object, they'll take one, they'll spray it with graffiti, or they'll cover it with sort of flowers and funky shapes. So really they're just turning it into some sort of accessory. I mean, at the moment, these are all over the streets of Tokyo. In a year's time, there probably won't be any left because another fad will have come along. So the Japanese will have just chucked them away. Lots of elements come together to make a classic. I think really it's wholeness. Something's got to be intact. It's got to have a totality to it. And also it has to be redolent with meaning in some way. It has to embody its time. And so when it's shrink-wrapped and opened up in 25 years' time, people will look at it and it'll shriek out about its particular age. To a certain extent, it's got to be an object that will look completely out of place in any other environment, whether it's another era or even a different country or culture.
25 years from now, this sort of thing will probably be seen as sheer insanity. This is an Audi Quattro at full song. 500 brake horsepower, wafer-thin body, and more acceleration than a fighter jet. But for design consultant Stephen Bailey, there is more to the four-wheel drive Quattro than raw power.
The Audi Quattro was the first practical, mass-produced car with intelligent four-wheel drive. It set dynamic standards, which still, 10 years on, have not yet been equalled. And significantly for the Audi company, it was a technological event. It was the first of a whole series of technical events which Ferdinand Piëch called for from his Audi engineers. Another aspect which makes it a classic is, of course, its styling. It's based on the shell of the original Audi Coupe, a fine car in its day, but a little anonymous. And an English designer called Martin Smith, who works for Audi's EDM studio in Munich, created a brand new gesture in the repertoire of automobile aesthetics. He created these huge, squared-off, flared wheel arches. Now, since then, there isn't a manufacturer on Earth which hasn't imitated them. It has about it a magnificent look of refined menace. I think success in motorsport is partly, by definition, a requirement of a car being a classic. The Audi Quattro had such prodigious dynamic ability that it totally dominated international rallying at the beginning of the 80s. And still, at the beginning of the 90s, imitations of the Quattro are still the cars which dominate the rallying scene. Ferdinand Piech, the engineer responsible, he said, driving an ordinary car is like sailing, but a Quattro is like skiing.
Inside this disused chocolate warehouse on the outskirts of Birmingham lies one of Britain's strangest collections of cars. Nearly all unused, some are rare, some are not. They represent a carefully selected cross-section of factory-fresh products. Alexander Patrick owns every one of them. He's a tough businessman with a soft spot for popular cars like the Ford Capri.
We felt that so many people had memories. This is the car, 1987 model, this one. We code everything by registration number here. That car was the last model, called a 280. The very last one was actually stolen and taken to bits and sadly no longer exists.
The Capri was built from the same components as another all-time classic, the Ford Cortina.
Ah, now the Cortina, that's a car, let me see. Yes, it's over here. That's a car that a lot of people will have memories of, and we put it into the Patrick collection because we felt that Grandad, when he brings the children along, will be able to say, well, I used to rep in one of these. This is the gear version, of course, in production something like 20 years. And everybody really started probably their repping life in a Cortina. I mean, the other manufacturers weren't competing in the same degree.
Anyone who owns a Cortina in mint condition already has an appreciating asset. This 10-year-old car has become an icon of British commercial life like no other product, yet few will survive.
The 1982 Ford Cortina, more than ever, a car above comparison.
Rather than shrink-wrapping his collection, Alexander Patrick makes sure all his cars are kept in running order. But will this ever be a classic?
What I suppose has always been thought as a joke car, but actually is now beginning to be taken rather more seriously. And so it's interesting how attitudes change about vehicles and so on.
Skoda is one of Europe's oldest manufacturing companies.
In 1983, 171,408 cars were made at Mladá Boleslav.
This car, a stalwart of communist, no-nonsense Czechoslovak engineering, will probably become a classic in its own right. Skoda is the only original communist car able to list Western European markets in its sales films.
Great Britain, Denmark, France, the Federal Republic of Germany, the Netherlands, Belgium, and Finland.
The popular motor cars, which are made in their hundreds of thousands, tend to be the ones that nobody cares or thinks about. And yet they're the ones that most people can associate with. And this is the important factor. If people can associate with something, then when they come around the Patrick collection, for instance, they can say, oh, I'd love a Ferrari GTO, that's my dream motor car. But I do remember this, and I remember we went off on a holiday and it broke down on Porlock Hill or whatever. And it's got lots of happy memories. So it's a nostalgic trip as well as something which is just talking about exotica.
Unlike Alice Rawson's zany Escargot, the Japanese cars here are startling for their ordinariness.
I'm not going to show it to you now, but of course we've got a Triumph Acclaim, which was the first Anglo-Japanese product. But we also have the Charade. This is the little three-cylinder car. Beautifully prepared, lovely engine, well made and manufactured, and entirely reliable. So that's a small family motor car, which the Japanese are so good at making. And then, of course, we go through from that to the Mazda RX-7. Now, you probably remember that NSU pioneered the rotary engine. But now I think the only manufacturer that actually fits a rotary engine is Mazda. And they've kept true to it. Now, this is one of their early sports models. And the RX-7, there is a new version of it now, but this is the previous version. This one's been turbocharged. A very nice, very pleasant motor car to drive, and an illustration of how the Japanese are moving on. And I think my favourite in the Japanese sports cars was the little original MR2. I mean, the latest one is smashing, but tends to look a little bit like a lot of other sports cars. The original MR2 was what I felt took the mantle of the MG Midget, the British sports car, and was the first really successful Japanese sports car.
If ever there was an instant classic sports car, it was the 1961 E-Type Jaguar.
This sleek, bullet-shaped car, related closely to the famous record-breaking D-Type, is way out on its own. A new thoroughbred, descended from a long line of champions, it sets the pace for tomorrow.
But tomorrow was to be a disaster for Jaguar. With the rise of fast German sports saloon cars and poor workmanship at home, Jaguar's fortunes declined.
For dispatch. Now ready for its lucky owner, it will be delivered within a day or so.
Today's Jaguars have survived not as state-of-the-art Eurobox Autobahn burners, but according to design critic Jonathan Glancy, as collectible examples of Englishness.
If you were to wrap this up, I think when you uncovered it in 25 or 50 years' time, you would find one of the great all-time classics of English design. There's no way you can mistake this car for being a German car, an American car, a Japanese car. It has a very particular character. When Jaguar try sales clinics and they remove all the badges off the cars, there's no doubt in people's minds that what it is. They don't have to say which is the Jaguar when they're looking at a mix of Japanese and German and American cars. Everybody says, well, oh, this is the Jaguar. Well, why do they say that? Because it has this very distinctive line that looks like no other car. So when you unwrapped it, you would say, look, first of all, the lovely surprise, a Jaguar. And more than that, an English car. And I think of machines like the Spitfire when I drive this car. I think of British railway locomotives, Gresley Pacifics, Stanier Pacifics, and so on. It has that kind of association of quality engineering. They were beautifully tamed with immense power. In other words, the lovely lines they had, these lovely curved lines, unadorned, simple, calm, hid the fact that they were quite brutish, powerful machines. And the Spitfire, terribly powerful machine of death, and that's not a very nice thing, but it looked poetic. A Gresley Pacific at the head of a railway train right up into the early 1960s. Again, poetry in motion. The same with the Jaguar. You have that poetry, and it's a very English poetry. It's a poetry of Wordsworth and Coleridge. It's not difficult German or Nordic or Japanese poetry. I think it's English poetry in motion. German machines, for instance, have these very aerodynamic shapes, so they have very high backs. Back of the car comes right up, which gives it a cheese wedge or ski slope look. And that's actually very disturbing when you see these things on the road. They're bulky. German cars look like fast trucks. A Jaguar, on the other hand, is a very low, calm-looking car. It's discreet, and I think discretion is a very important thing. It's part of what we celebrate about our Englishness.
Neither English nor a romantic, Jackie Stewart has developed some of the world's best racing cars. As a consultant to Ford, he helped improve the extraordinary RS200 Group B rally car, killed at birth by a change in the rules. Stewart worked on a variety of prototypes throughout 1985. Shortly after this, Ford were left with 150 hand-built, unraceable cars for sale. For product designer Sebastian Conran, the final version of this car became a classic the moment he saw it.
It was designed to win a class of rallying called Group B, which is sort of supercar rallying, really. But it ended because going 160 miles an hour through forests was really not on. The styling I find very interesting. It's very purposeful, I suppose, is the best way of describing it. I mean, the radiator here, which cools the compressed air that drives the turbo, and the outlet here, and it's sort of very sort of frog-like animal looks. It's almost, if you look at it, you think of those sort of dung beetles in the desert or something like that. It has a scarab quality to it. It's also, I mean, if you want to fill it up with petrol at the petrol station, you've got to do this to get at the petrol cap down here. It has a great deal of presence as you'll stand there and fill up with petrol. It was styled at the time when the Sierra came out, which introduced new styling on the scene, and it was not popular because of its styling. It replaced the boxy Cortina. It has the Ford vernacular of styling. It sort of reminds on a bit of a James Bond fantasy car designed for going underwater and exploring the bottom of the ocean with. And these great bug eyes, you know, it's very reminiscent of the styling of these subaquatic machinery. It's what the French would describe as joli laid, I suppose, you know, sort of ugly beauty to it. I can't think of very many other cars which are designed to be racing cars, but yet are road legal and very drivable and perfectly user-friendly and comfortable. I mean, you can drive this car all day and get out and feel fine. I mean, and yet it's a racing car. When they did fly through the air, as they have to, they flew straight rather than sort of back up, and so they didn't land on their noses. They landed with all four wheels at the same time. And it is made out of plastic. And in 25 years' time, I mean, people will find making cars out of steel a bit of a joke. Usually, one talks about classic cars as cars that have done particularly well in racing, or they've sold particularly well, or they were the most expensive car of their time. And I suppose this has sort of been stillborn, and, you know, it was drummed up to be the most wonderful car that was ever going to be, and there it was, but, you know, it was born redundant, like a lot of people are, I suppose.
The world motor industry produces about 35 million cars a year. Of these, a few 100,000 will survive, and of them, a handful might be kept as classics. This is a typical central London car park. Future classics lie scattered in the gloom, quietly rotting away. To save them means taking positive action, because, like us all, no matter how familiar or plentiful, cars die slowly, imperceptibly, until nothing remains but the memory.